Hey, Urban Youth Workers, it's Gabriel Zamora. I'm so excited to be with you today. I want to talk about a subject that I'm becoming increasingly more passionate about, and that's remembrance. In fact, we live in a world that's so forgetful. We're bombarded by information, but the Bible is replete with stories and sermons and ceremonies and festivals that are imploring us to remember all the time. In fact, Hebrews 11, the big Hall of Faith type chapter, is really a narrative on remembrance, remembering heroes of the faith that have went before us and they finished well or they suffered well all the way into the end in the latter part of the chapter. And this notion, this principle continues to kind of come at us about remembering and how it's a part of our faith. And you see when the Jewish people are coming out of Egypt and they're given these festivals to celebrate and remember the goodness of God. And they have these moments built into the calendar, the year of Jubilee, and how they always are pointing themselves back to God. But we live in a day and age that's not very easy. We're in an information overload. Our students are trying to handle so many different things. Social media has exacerbated the information overload. Everything's so accessible. And I think it's put us in a place as ministers in this kind of hamster wheel, if you will, this rat race to be more clever, to somehow say something in a way that is so unique that it will stand out in the realm of competing ideas with everything else that's on Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Netflix. And so we feel like if we just say it clever enough, then it'll be digestible. Then that's how we're really going to make a difference. Or I think that we even feel the pressure in our programming. If we could just be more creative. I know as a communicator, sometimes I feel the pressure to maybe if I say something revelatory, it's going to be incredible. But what's interesting is Peter comes to the churches in his letters and he says, I come to you by way of reminder. Not by way of revelation, not by way of some novel concept, but actually by way of reminder. In other words, he comes to them by way of something they already know, by something that they already know. And I really believe this, that if we don't learn to remember well and practice the spiritual discipline and teach our students how to do this well, we are going to be flailing in the wind because we're not anchored to a truth that is sustainable, that has stood the test of time, that God is not insecure. He's not freaking out. Jesus is still the truth, the way, and the life. And if we can learn to remember and go back to the stability that He is and practice that spiritual discipline, I believe it's going to be so much more healthy for our students. I think that the rise of anxiety, depression, and those things are really the result of us not knowing how to anchor our faith in the goodness of God in history. That is the human history and human experience, but also look at and remember the goodness of God in their own history of faith. Now, what I'm not saying is don't be creative. What I'm not saying is our programming doesn't need to reflect creativity and new concepts and new ways. But what I am saying is there is something about our faith that is ancient, that is old, and that there isn't a need to contemporize. There isn't a need to try to make something new. There are things about our faith and a relationship with Jesus that will only make sense in the context of faith. Baptism is still the immersion in water. And so there's not a way to really think creatively through that. We can not wear white robes and put on a t-shirt. But there is this ancient thing still of just immersion in water. And so when I'm looking back and I'm looking at people that have healthy faith and have healthy relationship with Jesus, and they're not moved by every new competing idea, and I'm looking at young people, it's those who have had the ability to look back on the history of God and their own personal history with God. David says this in Psalms 116:7, "Be at rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you." Past tense. "Be at rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. So he's able to look back at the goodness of God in and through his life, through the history of his experience. He's able to go back and say, God's been good to me, be at rest my soul. And I think our students are really struggling in an environment where there's political unrest and there's tensions everywhere they look, and they're in an information overload, but they need to be able to look back on their own history with God and say, be at rest. God's been good to me. I remember that moment at camp. And know how to celebrate a moment and bring the past into the present. When we remember something, it's almost as if we bring it into the present so that we can have peace in that moment and trust inevitably for our future. David says in Psalms 119:11, your word have I hidden in my heart that I not might sin against you. In other words, he's learned how to remember what God has said, that he wouldn't miss the mark. That word sin there is just he wouldn't miss the mark, that he wouldn't sin against him, that he wouldn't miss the mark, that he remembered and knew how to go forward from that point. So I think in our ministries, if we could revisit and try to find this place of practical application and making remembrance not just something that the old folks like to do sitting on their rocking chair and figure out, but actually braided into the whole of our ministry. Our future is linked to our ability to remember. It simply is. And so what we've started doing, and we have life groups, and what those are is just small groups where we're really breaking down the scriptures in community and beginning to share vulnerably. But what I've started to do is institute communion periodically in our life groups. And what that's allowed us to do is remember the simplicity and the power of the cross. Now, communion is old. It's remembering. It's already built into our faith, but we started to bring it back in. Now, there's not a way to really rethink drinking grape juice and breaking bread. But it's remembering that's so powerful. And then we begin to talk about what the gospel means in our life and remembering it. Through our social media efforts, we've decided to begin to remember things, not just from a marketing standpoint, but how could we revisit the stories and the things that God has been doing in and amongst us in the past year? How can we use then our social media platforms to celebrate stories and things that are going on within our youth ministry? I begin to tell students, you've got to make a habit of journaling so that you can look back and see that God is done something, that he's doing things, that he is working things out. Now, I have two boys, a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. I've never seen them grow. They grow too slowly, but I take them to the pediatrician, and every time they see that they've grown in weight and that they're growing taller, they measure it. But I've actually never seen it because it happens too slowly. When we learn to remember, what ends up happening is growth isn't always seen, but it is measured. When we learn to remember the goodness of God, we go into a new season and you realize, and your students will see, this thing would have tailed me off into a depression a year ago. But this year, I'm standing strong. We didn't see the growth, but we measured it, and we were only able to measure because we remembered. Because we actually remembered. So we're doing communion, we're teaching them to journal, we're putting it on our social media, and now we're creating little mementos. The children of Israel crossed over the Jordan River to go into the promised land after God tells Joshua to build monuments and then to tell their children about those things. And so what we've done is when God has wins in and amongst us, we actually build mementos. And it's as simple as this, a picture collage of an event that we did, of a story that was changed, of a camp that we went to, and then have those pictures there and be intentional about retelling the story throughout the course of the year and reminding the ministry about what God is doing, has done through our history and remembering. So I know we always want a new revelation. We're always trying to be creative. But I'm convinced that our faith is connected to our ability to remember. Our health presently, whether it has to do with anxiety and mental health and depression, all these things, and charting the course for the future, is so connected to our ability to remember the goodness of God. I love you, urban youth workers. I know you serve in some tough spots, but remember, the goodness of God is with you. Thank you.